Becoming Human, A Social Task, The Threefold Social Order by Karl König, edited by Richard Steele, translated by Carlotta Dyson. The Michaelmas Festival as a new festival of community, in memory of Rudolf Steiner's last address. The second of 3 lectures, given at Föhrenbühl, this one on Monday, September 28, 1964. Dear friends, it is 40 years ago today that Rudolf Steiner spoke to a larger circle of people for the last time. This was on September 28, 1924. Already in great pain and seriously ill, after an immeasurable amount of work and countless lectures in the preceding weeks, he once more gathered his forces to give an address. He told his audience that the approaching Michael mood, quote, which shall radiate from this day into tomorrow and the days following, unquote, gave him the strength to speak once more. Many of us here have made it a custom to read this address at Michaelmas and perhaps on other occasions throughout the year. Whenever one reaches out inwardly to what is here being said, tries to approach it, something quite particular arises in the soul, for these words engender a particular mood. Everything Rudolf Steiner said here was permeated by a mood that we can only describe as one of sorrow, as a mood of farewell. Those who were present at that time confirm this independently of one another. It is in fact the same mood of farewell which one can experience outside in nature at this time of year. The farewell which allows a gentle feeling of sadness to arise in the soul, a sadness which is deeply connected with the experience of the approaching autumn season. However, within the sorrow that resounds through Rudolf Steiner's words, there arises an impression of understanding filled with hope. And within the mood of farewell that comes towards us, something comes to birth that one can only describe as the germ of resurrection. In what is coming to an end, there lives the germ of resurrection. And what is the essential message of the last address? Rudolf Steiner looked back once more to the beginning of his activity in the cause of anthroposophy, to the year 1902, in which he gave the lectures later published as the book Christianity as Mystical Fact. The significant thing about this book is that at its center is the personality who was the author of the Gospel of St. John, Lazarus John. He is mentioned by name, more or less, for the first time. This is expressed in this book, which was Rudolf Steiner's first book about anthroposophy, in simple but unambiguous words. At the end of the wealth of lectures bestowed on us in the year of 1924, there were nearly 80 Karma lectures. At the end of all these lectures, Rudolf Steiner spoke once again, referring to the being who represented the beginning of all his Karma research, the being of Elijah John. In these Karma lectures, Rudolf Steiner had traced the destinies of leading personalities of the past, particularly of the 19th century, back to their previous incarnations. In this way, another arch is stretched, reaching across to Lazarus John, because in his last address, Rudolf Steiner revealed for the first time that the individuality of the Baptist and the individuality of the apostle are intimately connected to the extent that after his death, the Baptist's individuality works through the evangelist. In this address, Rudolf Steiner then traces the paths of this being through the Christian era, where he becomes the painter Raphael, who then, not so long ago, was the poet Novalis. The extraordinary thing about this address is that the period from 1520 to 1772, from the death of Raphael to the birth of Novalis, is about 250 years. This period is allowed to pass before our gaze. Rudolf Steiner opens the gates for us, as it were, and allows us to follow the path of this soul through the heavenly planetary spheres. At the end of this lecture, Rudolf Steiner issues an appeal. Now he suddenly tells us how necessary it is that human beings should come forward, that human beings who would be leaders of true Michaelmas festivals should join together. Let me read you the relevant passage. If in the near future, in 4 times 12 human beings, the Michael thought becomes fully alive, 4 times 12 human beings, that is, who are recognized not by themselves, but by the leadership of the Goetheanum and Dornach, if in 4 times 12 such human beings, leaders arise having the mood of soul that belongs to the Michael festival, then we can look up to that light, the light that shines through the Michael stream, and the Michael activity will be shed abroad in the future among mankind. End of quote. The fact that these were among the last words spoken by Rudolf Steiner to the community of members of the Anthroposophical Society, a call to community building around 4 times 12 people, a community building impulse under the sign of a Michaelmas festival renewed out of the Spirit. This fact we should really inscribe into our hearts. Rudolf Steiner impresses the closing words of this address like a seal upon what is to come, as it were. The words of that great Michael meditation, which begins, springing from powers of the sun. This is what can be described as the essential message of the last address. If, looking back on the preceding months, we see this address as a kind of crown, we become aware of how, from about April or May of the previous year, 1923, with ever-increasing intensity, Rudolf Steiner directs our attention towards Michael, towards the significance of Michael for our time, which is to awaken in us the endeavor to become pupils of Michael. On May 23, 1923, in Berlin, Rudolf Steiner gave a special lecture where, for the first time, as far as I can see, he pointed with this sense of urgency to the need for the institution of a renewed Michael festival. If we look at this lecture, it was the last one Rudolf Steiner held in Berlin, and so it also was a farewell, and once again sorrow sounded through this lecture. We can become conscious of the following. Rudolf Steiner began the lecture by referring to the destroyed Goetheanum. He spoke in deeply moving words about the fire. He said very significant things about it, and I would like to quote one sentence. Even if some kind of building for our purposes should arise on the same site, which should definitely come about, it cannot be a full replacement of the old Goetheanum because of the difficult circumstances of our time. Steiner then broke off and went on to speak at length about the development of walking, speaking, and thinking in the first 3 years of the child. The incarnating soul is endowed with the faculty of walking, the faculty of speaking, and the faculty of thinking through spiritual meetings and spiritual experiences before birth. On coming to earth from the spiritual world, these faculties then awaken in the small child as true humanity. He spoke at length about sleeping and waking, about death and rebirth, and then, at the end of an extraordinarily long lecture, filled with all the recent discoveries of anthroposophy, he suddenly refers to Michael and to the Michael festival, which at that time did not yet exist. There were, of course, traditional Michael festivals. Religious calendars carry the word Michael against September 29th. These were really peasant festivals, but the fact that a Michael festival once stood behind the harvest festival had been completely forgotten by most people. We would have to go far back into pre-Christian times to find that resurrection festivals were celebrated in the mysteries during the autumn time of the year. But now something new was to be started, and I need to read you some passages from the lecture, because they are the original words that were to lead to the renewal of the Michael festival. Quote, "If we are conscious of the secrets of the earth's circuit during the course of the year, we know that the Michael power is now descending again through the nature forces, which was not the case in previous centuries. This means that we can now meet the autumn, when leaves are falling, in anticipation of the descent of the Michael power from the realm of the clouds to the earth. Michael now begins to shine through the soul of the earth, as it is withdrawing into the body of the earth. When, however, the festivals, which today are celebrated without understanding, will again be understood, we will also have the strength, out of a spiritual understanding of the course of the year, to establish a festival which will only begin to have true significance for present-day humanity. This will be the Michael festival in the last days of September, when autumn approaches, the leaves wither, the trees grow bare, and nature approaches death, just as it approaches the budding of new life at Easter, when just in the dying down of nature we experience how the soul of the earth is uniting with the earth, bringing with it Michael out of the clouds." End of quote. The soul of the earth breathes in, and in our time, increasingly, since 1879, the Michael power has united itself with this breathing in, the streaming into the body of the earth, into man's environment, and thus into human souls during the autumn season. And this process, which takes place every year, but which is mostly overlooked by people because they sleep through it, should bring about something which is described by Rudolf Steiner in the following way. Quote, "For the moment it would be far more important that all other social reflections, which will only be fruitful in the present confused conditions if imbued with spirit, if a number of people with spiritual understanding were to come together for the purpose of instituting on the earth, out of cosmic forces, something like a Michael festival, an autumn festival that would be a worthy counterpart to the Easter festival. If something could be resolved upon, for which the motifs could only be found in the spiritual world, and which would create a feeling of fellowship among human beings at such a festival, created in the immediate present out of the fullness and freshness of the human heart, then this would be something which would create a social bond among people. End of quote. These are mighty words that should be not only intellectually affirmed, but taken up into the heart. Only then can they be transformed into action and strength of will. Quoting Rudolf, Steiner continues, "In the past, festivals created a close bond between people. Just think how much was done, spoken, and thought in preparation of these festivals, and at these festivals for the benefit of the whole culture. Because these festivals were established out of the direct inspiration of the spiritual world, their qualities were imprinted right into the physical." And then Rudolf Steiner concludes these deliberations with the following: "People should need to find the courage in their hearts not only to discuss outer social, organizational arrangements and so on, but to do something which will bind the earth to the heavens, which will again bind the physical conditions to spiritual conditions. Therefore the spirit will once again be introduced into earthly circumstances, and something would really happen among human beings that would constitute a powerful impulse for the further evolution of our civilization and the whole of human life." End of quote. Such words make clear the extent to which the proposed Michael festival, which is to be instituted, is to be a festival of community building, not a festival for the individual who withdraws into himself, but a festival for the individual who wants to be part of all the others. This is what it is about. If we look at this lecture as a whole, this last lecture held in Berlin, and from which I have quoted, one thing becomes clear. The Goetheanum ceased to exist, and the moment it disappeared, there arose the impulse to establish and institute Michael festivals, which were to have a community-building effect. You see, this is the Michaelic insight we should take away from this lecture. The fact that temples, buildings, architectural works of art, if they are authentic, have always been connected with occult or public social endeavors. Hence the name Mason, Freemason. The craftsmen, builders who built the cathedrals, the churches, were only able to accomplish this because they themselves formed part of a guild, for cathedrals and churches were erected in order to facilitate community. Any group of people who wanted to become a social community, a church congregation, or whatever, will experience the need for a building, or will first erect a building in order to be able to work together in it. This is one of the secrets of architecture, that it immediately brings about social architecture, social structure. And just as the Goetheanum arose and vanished. Forms of community should and would arise again out of Goetheanistic impulses. The church as a building unites the community of the faithful. Those who build the church constitute the circle of the initiated. That this is so becomes clear from another aspect of Rudolf Steiner's life work, namely from two lectures held in Stuttgart 10 years earlier, in 1913, also in the month of May, where Rudolf Steiner first points to the Michael impulse of our time. He does this at the very moment when the decision had been taken to erect the Goetheanum on the Dornach Hill. Thus we can say that the Goetheanum in its inception and its passing is framed by the Michael impulse. The Goetheanum is to be reborn in the Michael festival, creating and forming communities. If this is done in the right way, it cannot be destroyed by fire. This is one thing to which I wanted to draw your attention. The other thing I wanted to point to is a strange fact which probably belongs to reading the signs of the times, which Rudolf Steiner refers to in the opening of the last address. On September 28th, 16 years before his last address, and 100 years ago today, on September 28th, 1864, the first Socialist International was founded by Karl Marx in St. Martin's Hall in London. Earlier on, many workers' unions had been established. From the middle of the 19th century, the awakening proletariat had tried to establish itself as a force capable of shaping history. But today it is 100 years since an international labor movement was established. This is also an important sign of the times. The event took place 15 years before the dawning of the Michael Age. Workers from all over the world came together, realizing for the first time across the whole world that they constituted a united power. This initiative can be considered a Michaelic one because it transcended nations and was taken hold of by the will forces of human beings who, with justification, were striving for leadership roles. The fact that it turned out so differently is not the fault of the workers. It is the fault of the intellectuals who led them in an anti-Michaelic manner. It is important to ponder this. Now let us look back to what I hinted at concerning the Karlstein Castle. We are dealing here particularly, in the same way as with the Goetheanum, with a building which was intended to have a socially formative role. It was shaped out of Rosicrucian motivation. It arose out of this Rosicrucian motivation, and the intention was that it should point towards social political ideals that might have become realized. For an example, an ideal such as that of the Golden Bull, which I described to you at length last time. It was premature. Nobody could grasp it, and therefore, as an ideal, it had to be withdrawn again. But the building can be experienced as a threefold structure to this day. There is the imperial palace, which saw Charles IV's social activity. There are official reception rooms, private apartments and dining halls, in short, everything that a ruler requires to exercise their worldly power. That was the one building. If we walk through these rooms even today, we have the feeling, once it must have been filled with everything that the economy, the cultural power, and craftsmanship of people could produce in stone, precious stones, clay, and other materials. This is the first part. From this building, a little bridge leads to the second, the middle building, which mainly comprised a lady chapel, on the walls of which were depicted scenes from the Apocalypse. From this second building, which stands all by itself, separate from the first and rising above it, another bridge leads to the third building, which resembles a square tower, somewhat taller than the second and considerably taller than the first building. On entering, we have to climb a large number of steps with a series of pictures on either side describing the production of bread and the production of wine from the forces of nature through human work. Having reached the uppermost step, we see depicted above the door the chemical meal of St. Wenceslaus and St. Ludmilla. In opening the door, we find ourselves in the chapel of the Holy Cross. I have described how the walls are covered in semi-precious stones. On the upper part of the walls, there are pictures upon pictures of saints and martyrs. This chapel used to house the documents of the Holy Roman Empire, and at the same time it was a chapel for meditation and a chapel dedicated to the Christian ritual. The configuration of these three buildings points to the three spheres of the social organism. First, we have the imperial palace, filled with all the goods of the earth relating to the economic life. Separated from and independent of it is the second, the Lady Chapel, the sphere of the rites life. And again, independent from this, the tower with the Holy Cross Chapel, the sphere of spiritual life. In this structure, which was built in such a mysterious way in Central Europe, on the basis of Rosicrucian impulses, the future form of the social order of mankind stands in front of us, prefigured in architectural form. How can we understand this a little more clearly? We may ask ourselves, when we speak in this way about economic life, when we speak in this way about the right sphere, when we speak about spiritual life, what is all this in reality? Where are these spheres actually to be found? They do not arise because people work together, or because one group of people pronounces judgment on another, drafts legislation, or because people are artists and poets, scientists. When we ask the real question of where these three spheres are to be found, then there is only one possible answer. The sphere of economics, the sphere of economic life, that is our Mother Earth. For out of the earth, through human labor, everything grows that we need for life. The earth also gives us the water, the stones, the minerals, everything we need by way of clay or fiber. Up till now, she has bestowed all this on us in never-ending abundance. The fact that a different world has arisen in the last 100 years is no contradiction to this archetypal image that presented itself initially to our perception. Mother Earth is the home of everything that can be described as economic life. And what about the right sphere? Dear friends, why is the Lady Chapel decorated with scenes from the Book of Revelation? Because the Book of Revelation depicts the entry of the Logos into the world of the earth and of mankind. The right sphere is the sphere surrounding the earth, the sphere of language. Here a verdict must be spoken. Here also the expression, judgment is pronounced. Law and order express themselves in words alone. The human word, filled with the word of God, that is the law according to which we live and work here on earth. And what is it that comes to meet us up there in the chapel of the Holy Cross? There the saints and martyrs look upon us. There those who have died look upon us. For spiritual life, if we understand it rightly, is the sphere in which the dead, the sphere in which all the unborn have their homeland. Spiritual life becomes active where the living communicate with those who have already crossed the threshold or those who are beyond the threshold. The ancient teachers of wisdom who no longer come down to the earth. The angelic beings, the unborn. All this forms the background of spiritual life. And into this sphere, Michael radiates and shines, calling to us, gazing at us, waiting for us to recognize him. This is the call that goes out to us today. This is the call that sounds forth from Michael's messengers, who have been sent out to call men to come to the kingly wedding meal, as described in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. Then the one goes to work in his fields. The other has to give his daughter in marriage. The third needs to fill his purse. And thus for many, the call fades away. The call, which Rudolf Steiner spoke again in a new form with these verses. Springing from powers of the sun, radiant spirit powers, blessing all worlds. For Michael's garment of rays, ye are predestined by thought divine. And then there appears the countenance that shines through the sphere of the unborn and the sphere of the dead, saying, He, the Christ messenger, revealeth in you, bearing mankind aloft, the sacred will of worlds. This is the radiant power that appears, and out of the radiance the Logos now streams forth. Ye, the radiant being of ether worlds, bear the Christ word to man. The word, the Logos, streams down to men. Thus shall the herald of Christ appear to thirstily waiting souls, to whom your word of light shines forth in cosmic age of spirit man. This is the second sphere. This is describing the second sphere. It calls men to the royal wedding, and turning to it, it says, Ye disciples of spirit knowledge, take Michael's wisdom beckoning, take the word of love, of the will of worlds, into your soul's aspiring actively. Listen to the call. It says, "Come to the table of the royal wedding." With these words, Rudolf Steiner placed into our hands the tools for creating Michaelic communities, to celebrate Michael festivals, not to miss the call because we are asleep, but to meet it with alert will. This is what matters in our time which is a Michael age, a time when human beings should never again lose sight of the fact that the newly evolving Michael festival is to become the seed and the core of social communities.